I guess I shouldn't have been surprised when nothing turned up. It's not like I've done many exciting things with my life so far. All that popped up was a few school awards I'd won, and that was like it. I then decided to Google my parents. I put my dad's name in first, and I couldn't believe what came up. Dozens and dozens of images of a drag queen. But wait, that wasn't my dad. Yes, that guy had exactly the same name as my dad, but there was no way it was my dad. I clicked on the first link that appeared. I was intrigued now. Loud music started playing as soon as the site loaded. There were 4 drag queens featured on the page, and they all looked incredible. Like over-the-top glamorous with long sparkly eyelashes and excessive makeup and glitter. I was about to close the website when something caught my eye. There was a poster for an upcoming show with the drag queen who had the same name as my dad. I mean, my dad does have a pretty common name, so it's not that weird. But then I just couldn't stop laughing. My dad was the most serious businessman you could ever meet. I wanted to tell him what I'd found, but he'd probably turn his nose up at it and not even find it funny. He seriously lacked a sense of humor. I couldn't stop thinking about this drag queen with the same name as my dad. I found myself logging onto Instagram and searching for his name. Sure enough, there he was. It was odd because in a way he did remind me of my dad. There was just something about him. But at the same time, he was nothing like my dad. I started following him on Instagram, and if I'd been 21, I'd have totally gone to see the show. But alas, I was only 18, and it was too risky to try and sneak in. Before going to sleep, I deleted my Google search, just in case my dad somehow had access to my Google account. Like I said earlier, he's a serious guy, and a bit strict. And we don't exactly have the best father-daughter relationship. He's constantly on business trips in different states, and I swear I only see him on Sundays for lunch. As I drifted off to sleep, I thought how awesome it would be if my dad was even just a little bit like the drag queen who shared his name. Sure, it freaked me out a bit, but at least that guy looked like he had fun. My dad needed to loosen up a bit. The next day, the first thing I did was check my social media before heading off to school. I had clued myself up on drag queen terminology and was ready to impress my friends. I didn't tell them I'd followed that guy on Instagram, but throughout the day I kept watching his videos and he really made me laugh. His voice was so high-pitched. Obviously it was put on, but he was definitely a comedian in the making. The weeks went by and I found myself seriously becoming a fan of this guy. I'd do anything to see his show. It was coming up at the weekend, and the only way I could go would be if I was accompanied by someone over the age of 21. But who? I thought long and hard about it, and decided to ask my cousin Will. He was a student, and he was gay, and I figured that would be the kind of thing he'd be interested in. I called him, but unfortunately he couldn't make it, he said. Instead, though, he offered to give me his flatmate's ID. She was 22, and he said she looked similar to me, and that they wouldn't check it that carefully anyway. For the rest of the week, I was so nervous about it all. But by the time Saturday came around, I had the ID clutched tightly in my hand, and I'd worn a dress that made me look a bit older. I told my mom that I was going to watch movies at my friend's house, and that I'd be back later. Luckily, my dad was away on a trip, so I didn't need to explain myself to him. My hands were sweating so much when I arrived at the club that I thought the ID would slip right out of my palm. I stood in line and tried to act as confident as possible. It was bizarre to think that a few weeks ago, I wouldn't have been seen dead in a drag queen club, and yet here I was, doing everything I could to get inside. Oh, how things change. As the line snaked closer towards the front, I quickly applied a layer of lipstick, and then suddenly, I was at the front. I barely even made eye contact with the bouncer, and then the next moment, I was inside. Hang on, he hadn't even checked my ID. All that trouble for nothing. I bought my ticket and then walked through a massive red velvet curtain to find a seat. I wasn't about to risk buying a drink, so I just sat myself down and tried not to look awkward. Easier said than done when you're underage attending a drag show for the very first time in your life. I don't know what I'd expected, but everyone there looked quite normal. I think I'd gotten it into my head that the only people who attended stuff like this were drama queens. But there were even 2 old ladies sat in the front row. I guess I wouldn't stand out so much then. It took a little while for the show to start, but when it did, I was entranced. First up was a queen wearing a huge curly blue wig. He was hilarious and pranced around the stage telling jokes. I instantly liked him. He was so charming. I ran to the bathroom before the next performer, as I'd ended up buying a can of soda from the hostess. Without even realizing, I downed it and was now bursting. When I got back from the bathroom, I realized I'd missed the entrance of the drag queen with my dad's name. The whole reason I was even there in the first place. He was already out on stage, and he was wearing a long blonde wig and stilettos. I didn't want to interrupt his performance, so I waited at the back for an appropriate moment to head back to my seat. He was singing and I couldn't help but smile. He just had this incredible energy about him. Like, I wished he was my friend. He oozed confidence and he just seemed so comfortable up there. Plus, his voice was amazing. I couldn't take my eyes off of him. His first song came to an end, so I decided to take my chance and hurry back to my seat in the front row. Now I had a much closer view of him. And that's when it hit me. I felt winded, like someone had come up and punched me in the chest. It was him. It was my dad. I knew it as soon as I made eye contact with him. His whole demeanor changed, and he started stumbling over his words. I didn't know where to look or what to do. I wanted to run out of there and get fresh air, but I didn't want to make a scene. Somehow he managed to carry on with his performance, but as soon as he was done with that song, he rushed off stage. I could hear murmuring in the crowd as I ran out. I thought about going backstage and speaking to him about this, but I was in too much shock. Never in a billion years did I think my dad would do something like this. I mean, it didn't even make sense. He was supposed to be on a business trip. He was always on a business trip. And then it clicked. This whole time, had he been performing? And I just thought he was away on business? But why? He was living a double life, almost like he had two personalities, the boring dad and the glamorous drag queen. I had to find a way to talk to him. I sat outside on the curb for a while, trying to gather my thoughts. I couldn't go back inside. Did my mom know about this? How many people had he lied to? And seriously, why? I decided to call him. I nervously dialed his number and waited as it rang and rang. He didn't answer. I tried again, but still no answer. I knew he was ignoring my calls. He was probably angry that I'd snuck into a club, never mind the fact that I'd literally caught him in the act. This was a disaster. And yet, beneath my embarrassment, there was another unexpected feeling. Dare I say it, but I genuinely felt happy. My dad was actually way cooler and less miserable than I thought he was. Okay, so he was a drag queen, but hey, at least he wasn't as cold-hearted and boring as I'd originally thought. In fact, the more I thought about it, the more I realized I didn't even know my dad. What made him tick? How long had he been a drag queen for? And the big question, did my mom know about this? So many questions were running through my head. I knew I'd have to confront my dad sooner or later. I went home and my mom was already in bed, so I headed straight to my room. My phone beeped and I saw it was my dad. All it said was, "I'm sorry, I can explain. He didn't come home that night, or if he did, I was already fast asleep." The next morning, I heard him on the stairs and I stayed in bed, frozen. I felt so awkward. I knew he was embarrassed and I was too in a way, but I wanted to see him and talk about it. I finally plucked up the courage and headed towards my door. At that exact same moment, my dad was obviously about to knock on my door, and we completely banged into each other. He looked awful, like he hadn't slept a wink, and there was still a speck of glitter on his forehead. How had I not noticed this before, I thought? He asked if we could talk, and then he explained everything. He'd done a drag show back in college, just for fun, and he'd enjoyed it so much that he'd started doing it more often. He loved the thrill of being on stage, and that element of surprise that came with it. Just because he was a man, it didn't mean he couldn't enjoy wearing glitzy clothes and makeup. He was blushing the whole time that he told me this and apologized and said he understood if I needed some time to think things through. I looked at him and smiled. "Dad, you don't need to apologize. I'm just surprised. Actually, I discovered this drag queen with the same name as you when I Googled you one day, but I had no idea it actually was you. I thought he was so cool, and there was just something about him that I liked so much. I was drawn to him, and now I know why. Because he is you. I mean, you are him." And then we laughed. He came over and sat next to me and gave me the biggest hug he'd ever given me in my life. As we were hugging, I asked him one more question. "Dad, Does Mom know about this? He threw his head back and let out a roaring laugh. Of course she does, sweetie. She comes to a lot of my shows, and she even helps me with my makeup. She loves it. I was confused. But doesn't that mean that you're gay? No, sweetie. Not all men who dress as drag queens are necessarily gay. I couldn't believe it. The more I got to know about this secret hobby of my dad's, the more I started to understand him. And it made me realize that up until that point, I hadn't even really tried to get to know him. Looking back, we can laugh about it all, and my dad was almost relieved that I discovered his secret in the way that I had. He told me he'd been waiting for me to get a bit older before he told me, in case I didn't approve. Well, he definitely didn't need to worry about that. I am now his biggest fan.
The sea was lapping at the sand, and I could hear the waves roaring as they hit the shore. Birds tweeted and called around me while I walked down the beach on that warm, sunny morning. Everything was peaceful and tranquil, as it always was when I took my morning walk, until suddenly it wasn't. When I bent down to pick up a pretty piece of coral, my golden retriever, named Rufus, suddenly flew forward, snatching his lead out of my hand as he bolted ahead of me. I called his name so many times, but he didn't come back. All of a sudden, he stopped and started staring down at something in the sand. He was snuffling and moving pebbles around with his nose. Then he started barking loudly, and I was totally lost. I didn't understand why my dog was barking like a madman. I pinched myself just to check if I was dreaming, since it seemed totally bizarre. Rufus was usually such a good boy. I didn't understand why he was disobeying me all of a sudden. It wasn't like this was an unusual thing for us to do. We went to the beach twice a day for walks every day. We would always walk down the sand together while I collected any pretty shells I found along the way. You see, I did this because my mom and I were desperate for any extra cash we could get. So I started to make jewelry, which I could then sell at the local market every Sunday. But we were already almost finished with our walk, and I'd barely found anything good enough for us to use yet. It was really disappointing, and I didn't have time to deal with whatever issue Rufus suddenly decided to have. So I ran forward and grabbed him by the collar. "What the hell, Rufus?" I asked before I looked down and noticed why he was acting so freaky. There was something huge poking out from the sand that Rufus had dug up. At first, I just wanted to pull him away and go home because it stunk so bad. It was like vomit mixed with garbage. I had to pinch my nose to keep me from barfing. "Come on, Rufus, let's go," I told him as I tried to tug him away again, but he wouldn't budge. I sighed and shook my head. I moved away from the awful smell and decided to just let him have his fun and take him back once he got bored. But as time went on, Rufus didn't give up, and I really wanted to get home. "Fine, you win," I told him as I walked back over to him. I decided to take it home with us so that Rufus could play with it, and I could get back and get on with my homework. So I took off my jacket and wrapped up the awful-smelling rock. It was stupidly heavy, though, and I could barely lift it. But eventually, I managed to tuck it into my bag. As soon as Rufus saw that I had the mysterious gray thing, he ran up to me, and finally I was able to get home. I didn't think too much about the rock after that. I stuck it out in our backyard, where Rufus continued to sniff it and try to play with it for the rest of the day. But after that, it was pretty much gone from my head. It didn't help that I had far worse things to worry about. Because 6 months earlier, my dad had left my mom for another woman. He moved across the country, and we hadn't heard from him since. My mom and I couldn't really afford the rent on my childhood home, so we were selling everything we owned to try and get the money every month, but we were running out of things to sell. The day after Rufus and I found that strange rock on the beach, my mom showed me a letter that made my blood run cold. It was an eviction notice. I couldn't believe it. My heart felt like it shattered into a million pieces. Not only had I lost my father, but now I was losing my home. My whole world felt like it was falling apart. Everything happened so quickly then. My mom and I had to pack up the little belongings we had left and found a shelter that had room to take us in. I know it seems stupid, but I brought the rock with me since my dog had been so fond of it. So all I had left in the world was my mom, my dog, some clothes, and this stupid rock. The shelter wasn't exactly amazing, but it was nice to have a roof over our heads and somewhere comfortable to sleep. It beat sleeping on the streets, that's for sure. The people there were super weird, though. A lot of them clearly had mental health problems that they weren't getting any help for. Sometimes I woke up in the night to hear them screaming. But one day, an old man with a horrible cough stumbled into our room in the morning and stood there just staring down at my dog. I was super freaked out and cuddled up to my mom, waiting for him to leave, but he didn't. "What are you staring at?" I asked him. He pointed down at the rock my dog was curled up with. I couldn't believe that was what he was looking at. It was so stupid. I laughed. As a joke, I asked if he wanted to buy it from me. Straight away, the man's eyes lit up and he started nodding. I thought he was just another crazy homeless guy. So I laughed, and my mom did too, until he started getting angry at us. He started telling us that he wanted it, and he pulled money from his pocket, trying to hand it over to us. It was strange that he was so insistent, and that he had so much money at a homeless shelter. I asked him who he was, and he said he was there to visit someone. I was surprised. He wasn't a crazy, homeless man after all, and he was really interested in my dog's weird rock. "I'll give you $500 for it," he told me, and I had to stop my jaw from dropping. "How about 1,000? I replied, thinking I would scare him off or he would stop teasing me. The man nodded and started pulling more cash out of his wallet. I couldn't believe my eyes. This wasn't a joke, and that man was really trying to buy the rock for $1,000. What did he know about the rock that I didn't? It was getting creepy and weird, so I ended up telling the guy to leave. He protested at first and told me I should take the money since I was homeless. I almost caved right then and there. After all, $1,000 could get us an apartment for a month together, but something just didn't feel right. I needed to find out what on earth this rock was, and fast. So I packed it in my bag one day and took it over to my friend Joe's house. He's a bit of a science geek, and he knows a lot about the ocean. I thought maybe he could help me, but when I took it out, Joe didn't have the faintest clue about what it might be. We checked his books about the sea for a while and tried to identify whether it was some kind of precious stone or gem, but it didn't match anything we found. Feeling sad and hopeless, I went back to the shelter, and I had the biggest shock ever. My mom was sat in the middle of the room, crying and hugging my dog. Everything in our room had been torn apart, tipped over and ripped. Our beds were covered in feathers, and our clothes were strewn across the room. I just didn't understand what happened, and my mom was too upset to explain anything. One of the wardens at the shelter came to check on us and help us get everything back to the way it was. Well, at least as much as they could. When I asked them what had happened while I was gone, they said that it looked like we had been robbed. I was so confused. Why would anyone rob us? We were living in a shelter. We wouldn't be here if we had any money. The warden said that people can get desperate, and maybe they thought we had something worth selling, and that's when it hit me. It had to be the strange rock, right? There was just no other explanation. I needed to find out more. So I went back to Joe and asked him to hide the rock at his house for me while I investigated. I didn't want to risk it getting stolen. Joe agreed, and we started to delve deeper into the internet. Joe ended up searching for similar stories to mine in local newspapers, and what we found changed everything. Joe said that every few years, people have found horrible-smelling rocks in the sand, which have been worth a lot of money. He found a picture of a woman holding one that was way smaller than mine, and it said that hers sold for $10,000. Apparently it was called ambergris, and it was actually whale vomit. Ew! I couldn't believe I'd been carrying around whale vomit. It was so bizarre. That's when I started to think that it had to be some kind of joke. But when Joe showed me the proof, I almost fainted. Joe and I decided to contact some businesses online to get an estimate for what it was worth. Since we had such a huge piece, lots of people came from all over the state to inspect it. After a few days, I started getting crazy offers to buy a mysterious rock. One person offered $300,000 for it. Then the next offered $400,000. Joe and I were absolutely shocked. I didn't know what to do. This sort of money would change my life, but I didn't want to rush into anything. I told them I needed to think about it. I wanted to tell my mom, but I didn't want her to get her hopes up, and I thought maybe it would be a nice surprise for her. As I was entering the shelter that night, I was confronted by the strange old man again. This time, however, he didn't want to talk. He ran straight for me and grabbed my bag. He ripped it off my arm and searched inside it. "Where is it, little girl?" he snapped at me. I knew he wanted the ambergris, and I was so glad I left it at Joe's to keep it safe. "I've sold it. You'll never get it," I told him. That's when he went crazy. He surged forward and tried to grab me. I screamed and closed my eyes, but nothing happened. After a few seconds, I opened my eyes to see something amazing. Rufus had run out and jumped on the old man, knocking him unconscious. He had protected me from him. I raced toward him and hugged him close. I told him he was such a good boy, and I really meant it. Right from the start, Rufus had been looking after me, and he'd even found a way for Mom and me to make the money we needed to be secure again. The shelter called the police after I told them I was almost assaulted. The man was taken away and told he was never allowed in the shelter again. I was so relieved, but I still had the ambergris to sell. The next day, I decided I wanted to get it over and done with. I checked my emails, and just as I was about to accept the offer for $400,000, my phone beeped. It was another email from a perfume company. They wanted to buy the rock for $500,000! I couldn't believe it! I cried with happiness and accepted. So, what did you think of my story? Remember to like, comment, and subscribe for more content.